The chandeliers of the Metropolitan Innovators Gala dripped light like frozen tears onto the city's elite. It was a room built for triumph. A gilded cage where success was measured in the weight of a watch and the cut of a suit. Alara Vance stood near the edge of the stage, a statuesque figure in a simple but elegant crimson gown. The color was a deliberate choice, not the burnt orange of her everyday armor, but the deep, resonant hue of a heart that had been tested by fire. Tonight, she was to receive the Foundation's Humanitarian of the Year award for her Phoenix project, a revolutionary sustainable urban development designed to breathe life back into the city's forgotten industrial districts. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and ambition, crackled with polite applause as Julian Croft took the podium to introduce her. He was charisma, personified a sharp jawline, eyes that held a predatory gleam, and a smile that could disarm armies. He was Alara's chief rival, the CEO of Croft Holdings, a man who built skyscrapers that scraped the heavens but cast long, cold shadows on the earth below. "Good evening," Julian began, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that wrapped around the room. "We are here tonight to celebrate innovation, to honor those who dare to dream. And no one—" He paused, letting the silence hang. Dreams quite like Alara Vance. A polite ripple of laughter. Alara maintained a serene expression, a mask of composure she had perfected over 2 decades. "She has built an empire from the ground up," Julian continued, his gaze finding hers across the crowded ballroom. "A truly remarkable feat, considering her unconventional origins." The phrase landed like a perfectly aimed dart, subtle enough to be deniable, sharp enough to draw blood. The word unconventional was a piece of polite code in their world, a delicate substitute for unworthy, for other. He was reminding them all that she hadn't come from their world of legacy wealth and ivy-covered walls. "She speaks of building communities," he went on, the smile never leaving his face, "of laying new foundations. It is a noble sentiment, but we in this room know that the strongest structures can only be built on solid ground. One must always question the true source of a foundation. Is it built on rock, or on the rubble of another's failure?" The air grew still. The clinking of champagne flutes sounded like brittle promises. To most, his words were just competitive posturing, the kind of veiled jab common in their cutthroat industry. But for Alara, they were a key, turning a lock on a room she kept buried deep inside her. 15 years ago, the smell of rain-soaked cardboard and despair. Their family home, stripped bare. Her father, Robert Vance, a brilliant architect with a heart too trusting for the world he occupied, sat on an overturned packing crate in the empty living room. He wasn't crying. His grief was a void, a hollowed-out silence that was far more terrifying. In his hands, he turned over a small, tarnished silver compass, its needle spinning uselessly. It had been his father's, a symbol of finding one's way. Now, it was just a broken trinket. "He promised me." Alara. Her father's voice was a dry rasp, the sound of a spirit ground to dust. "He said our foundation was solid. He called our venture North Star, a guiding light. The business partner, a man whose name was a curse whispered in their house for years, had vanished, taking with him their investments, their patents, their future. He had left them with nothing but debt and the ghost of a promise. The collapse of North Star Ventures hadn't just been a financial ruin. It had been a public disgrace, a stain that followed their family name like a shadow. Julian's voice pulled her back to the present. He was still smiling, the perfect picture of magnanimity, and so, with great admiration for her tenacity, "I present to you the Humanitarian of the Year, Alara Vance." The room erupted in applause. It was a wave of sound, powerful and overwhelming. But Alara barely heard it. The echo of Julian's words, the rubble of another's failure, was a roaring in her ears. He had used the language of her deepest trauma, of her father's ruin, and he had done it on the biggest stage of her life. As she walked toward the podium, her crimson dress flowing behind her, her composure was no longer just strength. It was a declaration of war. She took the heavy glass award, her grip firm, her smile a perfect, unreadable mask. Her fight for the Phoenix Project had just become something far more personal. This wasn't about business anymore. It was about ghosts. The first strike came less than 12 hours later. Alara stood in her office, a sanctuary of natural light, warm wood, and sprawling blueprints that covered every surface. It was a space that reflected her philosophy: transparent, organic, built for growth. The view from her floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the very district the Phoenix Project was meant to transform, a patchwork of derelict warehouses and forgotten factories, waiting for a second chance. Anya Sharma, her brilliant junior analyst and tech prodigy, stood before her desk, her face pale. They flagged the geological survey. Alara, the City Planning Commission received an anonymous report claiming our data is fraudulent. They're putting a hold on the preliminary zoning permits. Alara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The geological survey was the bedrock of the entire project. It had been conducted by the most reputable firm in the country. To call it fraudulent was not just an accusation. It was an attack on the project's very soul. "It's him," Alara said, her voice quiet but firm. She didn't need to say the name. "The report is sophisticated," Anya continued, swiping through data on her tablet. "It's filled with falsified soil composition charts, seismic risk models that are pure fiction. But it looks convincing. It looks like we were cutting corners, endangering the entire district." Marcus Thorne, her mentor and the former CFO of her father's company, stepped into the office, his presence as solid and comforting as the oak desk he leaned against. He was a man in his late 60s, with kind eyes that had seen too much and a loyalty that had never wavered. He had been there during the fall of North Star Ventures, and he had been by Alara's side ever since, a quiet guardian of her father's memory and her own burgeoning ambition. "I just got off the phone with two of our primary investors," Marcus said, his voice grave. "They're spooked. Julian Croft has already reached out to them with a contingency plan. His new Olympus Tower project. A cold, glass and steel monstrosity right on the edge of the Phoenix district. He's positioning himself to pick up the pieces." The strategy was clear: discredit her, stall her project, and then swoop in to claim the territory with his own soulless vision of progress. It was a corporate raid, dressed up in public concern. "He didn't just attack me last night," Alara said, looking out at the skyline. "He was laying the groundwork for this." Every word was calculated. "What do we do?" Anya asked, her youthful energy now laced with anxiety. Alara turned from the window, her gaze sweeping over the blueprints of the Phoenix Project, the green roofs, the community gardens, the integrated public housing, the small business incubators. It was more than a development. It was a promise to build something that nurtured, rather than dominated. A promise to her father's ghost that a foundation could be built on integrity. "We fight," Alara said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the uncertainty in the room. "Anya, I want you to trace that anonymous report. I don't care how deep you have to dig. Find its origin. Marcus, call a meeting with the board. I want to face them directly. We're not going to hide from this." She walked over to a small, framed photo on her bookshelf. It was one of the few she had left of her father. taken years before the collapse. He was smiling, holding the tarnished silver compass in his palm. After his death, Marcus had given it to her. She kept it locked away, a painful reminder of what they had lost. Julian Croft wanted a war fought in whispers and spreadsheets, in backroom deals and public smears. He had made a grave miscalculation. He thought he was attacking a businesswoman. He had no idea he was facing a survivor who had been forged in the very fires he was now trying to light. The battle for the Phoenix Project had begun, and Alara would not let her father's legacy be turned to rubble a second time. The boardroom at Advanced Development was designed to inspire confidence. A long mahogany table reflected the morning light, and the chairs were upholstered in a deep, calming blue. But today, the atmosphere was anything but calm. The air was thick with tension, a palpable unease that emanated from the half-dozen board members seated around the table. They were people who dealt in risk, but they despised uncertainty. And Julian Croft had just served them a banquet of it. He sat at the far end of the table, an invited guest of a particularly skittish board member. He looked perfectly at ease, a wolf in a bespoke suit, observing the nervous sheep. "Alara, we're all concerned," began Lawrence Schmidt, the board member who had invited Julian. "Allegations of fraudulent data. This could be catastrophic for our brand." "The allegations are baseless, Lawrence," Alara stated, her voice even and measured. She stood at the head of the table, a stark contrast to the seated, anxious men and women. The geological survey was conducted by GeoStruct, a firm with an impeccable 30-year record. "We have every piece of their raw data, signed and verified." Julian let out a soft, sympathetic sigh. "Alara, your passion is truly inspiring," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's a shame that passion alone can't guarantee a project's structural integrity. A simple oversight in the soil analysis, a miscalculation. These things happen. It's better to catch them now than when a building collapses." The insult was perfectly veiled, a professional concern wrapped around a dagger. He wasn't accusing her of malice, but of incompetence, a far more insidious poison in the corporate world. "There was no oversight," Alara countered, her eyes locking with his. "The report sent to the commission was a forgery. My team is already working to trace its origin." "A forgery," Schmidt scoffed, shifting in his seat. "That's a serious claim. Do you have proof?" "We will," Alara said, her confidence unwavering. Julian leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Perhaps this is a sign," he suggested, his tone reasonable, almost helpful. "The Phoenix Project is ambitious, noble, even. But maybe it's too much, too soon. My Olympus Tower, on the other hand, is a straightforward commercial venture. High yield, low risk. It could be a safety net. For the investors, for the city." He was offering them an escape route, a simple path back to familiar, profitable territory. He was preying on their fear. Alara saw the doubt flickering in their eyes. She had to reclaim the narrative. She turned to the screen behind her and projected the Phoenix Project's charter. "This project is not just about buildings," she said, her voice resonating with the conviction that had won them over in the first place. "It's about revitalization. It's about creating jobs in a district that has been ignored for 50 years. It's about building affordable housing, green spaces, and community centers. That is the mission you all signed on for. It is the foundation of this company." She then turned her attention back to Schmidt. "You asked if I have proof of a forgery. I have a better question. Are you questioning the data from the independent auditors? Or are you questioning my right to present it?" The room fell silent. She had turned the tables, subtly exposing the bias in his question. It was no longer about her competence. It was about their faith in her leadership. Julian's smile tightened at the edges. He had underestimated her poise under fire. Marcus, who had been sitting quietly beside Alara, finally spoke. "I've reviewed the financials and the project timeline," he said, his steady voice cutting through the tension. "A 3-week delay for the commission to verify our original data is well within our contingency planning. There is no financial risk. The only risk is allowing fear to dictate our strategy." The board members exchanged glances. Marcus's word carried the weight of decades of experience. His calm reassurance was the antidote to Julian's carefully crafted panic. The meeting ended without a resolution, but Alara had held the line. As the board members filed out, Julian approached her. "A masterful performance, Alara," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You handle a crisis well. It's a useful skill to have, especially when one's past is so full of them." The reference to her family's history was unmistakable. He was digging at her deepest wound, trying to unearth the doubt and pain she had worked so hard to bury. Alara met his gaze without flinching. "My past taught me to recognize a predator when I see one, Julian, and it taught me how to survive them." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the empty boardroom. The first battle was over, but the war was escalating. She knew Julian wouldn't stop. His attack was too personal, too vicious. There was something more than business driving him, a darkness she couldn't yet see. And as she walked back to her office, she felt a cold certainty settle over her to save her project. She would have to uncover it. The next few weeks were a siege. The media, fed by anonymous leaks, began publishing speculative articles questioning the viability of the Phoenix Project. City officials, once enthusiastic supporters, became distant and non-committal. Alara felt the walls closing in, a familiar sensation that brought back the suffocating anxiety of her youth. Her only refuge was the late-night strategy sessions with Anya and Marcus. In the quiet of her office, with the city lights twinkling below, they became a tight-knit unit, a small island of trust in a sea of suspicion. Anya worked relentlessly, her fingers flying across keyboards, her eyes scanning lines of code. She was a digital archaeologist, sifting through layers of cyberspace to find the ghost in the machine. "He's good. I'll give him that," Anya said one night, rubbing her tired eyes. She was surrounded by empty coffee cups and takeout containers. The report was sent through a cascade of proxy servers, bouncing from Singapore to Estonia to Brazil before it ever hit the Commission's inbox. It's designed to be untraceable. "But nothing is truly untraceable," Alara said, more as a statement of faith than of fact. "Exactly." Anya's eyes lit up with a spark of renewed determination. "He left a breadcrumb, a tiny one, a fragment of embedded metadata in one of the forged images. It's encrypted, but the encryption signature is weird. It's an old protocol, almost archaic." While Anya hunted in the digital world, Marcus navigated the human one. He spoke to old contacts at City Hall, took calls with nervous investors, and acted as Alara's unwavering shield. "They're afraid of the vision. Alara," he told her during one of their quiet talks. He was looking at the photo of her father on the bookshelf. "People like Croft. They build monuments to themselves. You're trying to build a legacy for others. It threatens them. It reminds them of their own emptiness." He paused, his gaze softening. "Your father would be so proud. He always said that a building without a soul is just a box of stone. He wanted to build something that lived and breathed." Those words were a balm to Alara's frayed nerves. Marcus didn't just offer strategic advice. He tended to the wounds of her past, reminding her of the why behind her fight. It was for her father's memory, for the dream he never got to realize. One evening, Elara found herself staring at the blueprints, the elegant lines and hopeful curves blurring before her eyes. The pressure was immense. She felt the weight of her employees' futures, the hopes of the community, and the ever-present shadow of her family's failure. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the fear. What if Julian was right? What if she was destined to repeat her father's mistakes? She pulled a small, locked box from her desk drawer. Inside was the tarnished silver compass. She held it in her palm, its cold weight a familiar ache. The needle still spun, lost and directionless. She closed her eyes, remembering her father's empty gaze. It was a memory that had fueled her for years, driving her to build an empire so solid, so undeniable, that no one could ever take it away from her again. But now, the memory felt different. It wasn't just fuel, it was a warning. Julian's attacks felt personal because they were aimed at the very foundation of her identity. Suddenly, Anya burst into the office, her face flushed with excitement. "I got it," she exclaimed, holding up her tablet. "I broke the encryption on the metadata fragment. It wasn't a standard protocol, because it wasn't from a standard company. It was custom-made for an investment firm that went bankrupt 15 years ago." She turned the tablet to face Elara. On the screen was an old, pixelated logo, a stylized star with a single, sharp point aimed north. Alara's breath caught in her throat. Her blood ran cold. It was the logo for North Star Ventures. The compass in her hand suddenly felt heavy as lead. Julian Croft wasn't just a rival. His sabotage wasn't random. He was connected to her past, to the single greatest tragedy of her life. The ghost she had been running from had a name, and he was trying to bury her alongside her father. The discovery that North Star Ventures was tied to the sabotage sent a shockwave through their small circle. For Elara, it was a sickening confirmation of her deepest fears. This wasn't just a corporate battle. It was a ghost story, and she was being haunted. "This changes everything," Marcus said, his face grim as he studied the logo on Anya's tablet. "Julian Croft isn't just some rival developer. He has to have a personal connection to what happened." "We need to know what it is," Elara said, her mind racing. "Anya, I need you to dig into Croft, not his business, his history, his family. Where did he grow up? Who were his parents? I want to know everything." While Anya dove into a new line of inquiry, Marcus focused on their immediate problem, the board and their investors. The linchpin of their support was David Chen, an early investor who had become a trusted friend and board member. He was a savvy financier who had always championed Elara's vision. "I'll talk to David," Elara decided. "He has influence. If I can get him to make a public statement of support, it will calm the others." She met David for lunch at a quiet restaurant, a place of hushed tones and discreet service. He was impeccably dressed, his smile warm and reassuring as always. "Elara, I'm so sorry you're going through this," he said, his expression a mask of sympathy. "Julian Croft is a shark, but don't worry, we're all behind you." "I appreciate that, David," Elara said, feeling a wave of relief. "That's why I'm here. I need more than private support. I need you to go on the record. A statement to the press. A vote of confidence. It would mean the world right now." David's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Of course," he said, recovering quickly. "But we need to be strategic. Perhaps it's better to wait until you have concrete proof of the forgery. A premature statement could look defensive." His hesitation was a small, discordant note in an otherwise perfect melody of support. Elara pushed the feeling aside. blaming her own heightened paranoia. "You're probably right," she said, "but I know we'll find it." She left the lunch feeling unsettled. David's caution felt less like strategy and more like an excuse. 2 days later, the bomb dropped. Anya called Alara into her workspace, her face ashen. She didn't say a word, simply turning her monitor toward Alara. On the screen was a complex web of financial transactions, a maze of offshore accounts and shell corporations. Anya had done what she did best. She had followed the money. After discovering the North Star connection, she had started digging into the old firm's liquidated assets, looking for any trail that might lead to the present day. She found one, a dormant holding company, registered in the Cayman Islands, had been reactivated 6 months ago. From that account, a series of payments had been made. The first was to a disgraced data analyst in Zurich, an expert in creating sophisticated forgeries. The second was to a well-connected lobbyist in City Hall, known for his ability to sow doubt and delay projects. The final payment, a transfer of $2 million made just last week, was the one that made Alara's world tilt on its axis. The recipient was a private wealth management firm. The client account belonged to David Chen. The betrayal was absolute, a physical blow that knocked the air from her lungs. David hadn't just been an investor. He had been a friend. He had sat in her office, listened to her dreams, and celebrated her victories. He had advised her, mentored her, and, all along, he had been working for the other side. She wasn't just fighting an external enemy. The call was coming from inside the house. "He played me," Alara whispered, sinking into a chair. The sense of isolation was crushing. The gilded cage of her success suddenly felt very small and very cold. Who else was lying to her? Who else was a part of this web? Marcus entered the room, took one look at her face in the screen, and understood. He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "This is what they do, Alara," he said, his voice a low rumble of anger. "They find the cracks and pour in the poison. They turn your friends against you." Alara looked up at him, her eyes filled with a new, hard light. The pain of the betrayal was there, but beneath it, something else was crystallizing. Resolve. The kind of cold, clear resolve that only comes when you realize you have nothing left to lose. "He's a pawn," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Julian is using him. And if we can find out who's funding Julian, we'll find the real puppet master." This was her midpoint, her lowest ebb. She was surrounded by enemies, betrayed by a friend, and haunted by the past. But in that moment of absolute isolation, she found a new kind of strength. She no longer had the luxury of trust. All she had was her own ingenuity, her own courage, and the unwavering loyalty of the two people left in her corner. The game had changed. It was no longer about defense. It was about hunting. The betrayal cut deep, but it also clarified the stakes. Alara, Marcus, and Anya retreated into a state of heightened alert, operating as a clandestine unit within their own company. Every communication was encrypted, every meeting held in secret. They couldn't trust anyone else. "David Chen is just a symptom," Alara declared in their new makeshift war room, a soundproofed conference room Anya had personally swept for listening devices. "He's a greedy man who was bought. The real question is, who has the kind of money and motivation to buy him and fund Julian's entire crusade against me?" Marcus, who had spent the last few days combing through his memories of the North Star collapse, suddenly looked up from his notes. His face was pale. "There was another partner," he said slowly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Your father and Julian's father." They weren't the only ones. There was a third man, a silent partner who handled the offshore investments. He was brilliant, ruthless, and he vanished a week before the company went under. "What was his name?" Alara asked, leaning forward. "Arthur Finch," Marcus said. The name hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. He was the architect of the financial structure. When everything collapsed, all the blame fell on your father and on Julian's. Finch's name was barely mentioned in the press. He was a ghost then, and he's been a ghost ever since. A new target, a name for the phantom pulling the strings. Anya's fingers were already a blur on her keyboard. "Arthur Finch," she murmured, her eyes scanning search results. Hardly any public profile. A few mentions in financial journals from 20 years ago. Then, nothing. It's like he fell off the face of the earth. "People like Finch don't disappear," Alara said. "They just change their name. They hide behind layers of corporations." The hunt for Arthur Finch became their singular obsession. Anya worked backwards from Julian, analyzing the corporate structure of Croft Holdings. On the surface, it was clean, but deep in the sub-levels of its financing, she found a labyrinth of private equity firms and holding companies. One firm, in particular, caught her eye: Peregrine Capital. It was Julian's primary backer. Peregrine, a type of falcon, Anya mused. Like a finch. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. She dedicated herself to cracking Peregrine's digital fortress. It took her a week of sleepless nights, but she finally found a vulnerability: an old, forgotten server maintenance port. Once inside, she didn't find a direct link to Arthur Finch. She found something better. She found the lie. In a folder of archived emails, she uncovered the correspondence that had set the entire tragedy in motion. 15 years ago, Arthur Finch had systematically manipulated both Robert Vance and Edward Croft, Julian's father. He had fed each of them a separate narrative of betrayal. He sent forged documents to Julian's father suggesting Robert Vance was embezzling funds to a secret account. Simultaneously, he showed Alara's father falsified reports that Edward Croft was selling their patents to a competitor. He had turned two partners, two friends, into bitter enemies. While they fought each other, Finch quietly siphoned the company's assets into his own offshore accounts. When North Star Ventures finally imploded under the weight of the manufactured distrust, Finch had already escaped with a fortune, leaving the Vance and Croft families to face the public ruin and financial devastation. He had not only destroyed them, he had made them believe they had destroyed each other. Alara read the emails, her heart pounding with a mixture of horror and vindication. All these years, she had carried the shame of her father's failure. Now, she saw the truth. He hadn't been a failure. He had been a victim. A good man destroyed by a monster's greed. And Julian. Julian had been raised on a lie. His entire life. His relentless ambition. His seething, personal animosity toward her. It was all built on a foundation of poison, carefully laid by Arthur Finch. His vendetta wasn't just business. It was a twisted quest for revenge against the man he believed had ruined his family. "He doesn't know," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper. "He has no idea." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Anya uncovered the smoking gun, a sworn affidavit from Finch's former accountant, a man who had been living in fear for 15 years. Anya had tracked him down to a small town in Vermont. Marcus, using his old-world charm and the promise of protection, had convinced him to talk. The affidavit detailed the entire scheme, complete with account numbers, transaction dates, and a confirmation that Arthur Finch was, indeed, the sole owner of Peregrine Capital. They had it all: the motive, the means, the proof. The City Planning Commission's final public hearing for the Phoenix project was in 2 days. It was meant to be the final hurdle for Alara's project. Now, it would be a tribunal. Julian planned to use the hearing as a stage to deliver his killing blow. He had no idea Alara was about to bring down the entire theater. The hearing room at City Hall was a pressure cooker, a sterile, wood-paneled arena where careers were made and broken. The air was suffocatingly hot, thick with the glare of television cameras and the low murmur of reporters and concerned citizens. Every seat was filled. The fate of the Phoenix project, Alara's reputation, and her entire company hung precariously in the balance. Alara sat at a long table at the front of the room, flanked by Marcus and Anya. She was the picture of calm, her crimson dress a bold statement in the beige room. Across from her, Julian Croft sat with his legal team, looking confident, almost triumphant. He believed this was his coronation, the moment he would finally vanquish the ghost of his family's past by destroying the daughter of the man he held responsible. The commission chair, a stern woman named Councilwoman Albright, called the hearing to order. Julian was invited to speak first. He walked to the podium with a predator's grace. He began by expressing his deep, feigned concern for the city's safety. He presented the forged geological reports, his voice resonating with authority as he pointed out the fabricated flaws, the non-existent seismic risks. "This is not just negligence," Julian declared, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. "This is a reckless disregard for the lives and safety of the people of this city." Then he made it personal. This pattern of recklessness, of cutting corners, is not new. Some of you may remember a company called North Star Ventures, which collapsed 15 years ago, devastating countless families. It was a company built on a cracked foundation, led by a man who put ambition before integrity. That man. Julian paused, turning to lock eyes with Alara. Was Robert Vance? Gasps rippled through the room. Alara felt a tremor of fury, but she held it in check, her face an unreadable mask. Anya placed a reassuring hand on her arm under the table. "The Phoenix Project," Julian concluded, his voice ringing with false righteousness, "is not a story of rebirth. It is the continuation of a failed legacy. I urge this commission to reject it, for the good of the city, and in the name of every family that has ever been harmed by the Vance's reckless ambition." He returned to his seat amidst a flurry of camera flashes and shocked whispers. He had played his hand, revealing the rotten core of his motivation. He thought he had delivered the final, crushing blow. Councilwoman Albright cleared her throat, her expression grim. "Ms. Vance, you may respond." Alara rose and walked to the podium. She did not look at Julian. She looked at the faces in the crowd, at the commission members, at the cameras. She let the silence stretch, drawing all the tension in the room toward herself. "Mr. Croft is right about one thing," she began, her voice clear and steady. "This is about a legacy, but he has the story wrong." She didn't defend. She attacked. "The geological report Mr. Croft presented is, as my team has proven, a masterful forgery." On the large screen behind her, Anya projected the evidence: the traced IP addresses, the encrypted metadata, the server logs that led directly back to a shell company owned by Croft Holdings. The room filled with murmurs. "But a forgery of this sophistication requires funding," Alara continued, "and it requires inside help." She looked directly at a reporter from the city's largest financial journal. "It requires the betrayal of trusted associates." On the screen, Anya projected the bank statements from the Cayman Islands account, showing the payments to the forger, the lobbyist, and finally, the $2 million transfer to David Chen. A new wave of gasps swept the room. Chen, who was sitting in the back, turned ghost white and tried to shrink into his seat. Julian's composure finally cracked. A flicker of panic crossed his face. He hadn't expected her to have this level of proof. Mr. Croft speaks of my father's company, North Star Ventures. Alara's voice grew stronger, imbued with the power of a truth held back for too long. He is correct that its collapse was a tragedy. It destroyed my family. It left my father a broken man. But he is wrong about who was responsible. Julian shot to his feet. This is a hearing about zoning permits, not a history lesson. She is trying to deflect. Please sit down, Mr. Croft, Councilwoman Albright ordered, her eyes now fixed on Alara with intense interest. You believe my father destroyed your family, Alara said, her gaze finally meeting Julian's. There was no hatred in her eyes, only a profound, tragic pity. You've spent your life believing a lie. She turned back to the commission. The truth is, both of our fathers were destroyed by the same man, a silent partner who pitted them against each other, who bled their company dry, and who vanished with a fortune, leaving them to take the fall. A man named Arthur Finch. On the screen appeared the old North Star Ventures partnership agreement, with Finch's name clearly visible. It was followed by the damning emails, showing Finch's two-fronted manipulation. The room was utterly silent now. The only sound, the frantic clicking of cameras. Julian stared at the screen, his face a mask of disbelief. The entire foundation of his life, the singular motivation for his hatred and ambition, was crumbling before his eyes. You talk about legacy, he roared, his voice cracking with desperation and rage. He was unraveling. Your father, Robert Vance, destroyed my family. He bankrupted my father and left him with nothing. He held up a crumpled, yellowed newspaper clipping, the headline screaming about the North Star collapse. No, Julian, Alara said, her voice softening with a sorrow that was almost overwhelming. Arthur Finch destroyed them both, and for the past 15 years, he has been using you. He has been funding your company, fueling your hatred, and using you as a weapon to make sure I could never rebuild what he tore down. For her final move, she presented the ultimate proof. This, she said, her voice ringing with authority, is the sworn affidavit of Finch's former accountant. The document filled the screen. It was a complete confession, a detailed map of Finch's entire criminal enterprise, from the initial fraud at North Star to the funding of Julian Croft and the sabotage of the Phoenix Project. It named Arthur Finch as the sole owner of Peregrine Capital. The room erupted. Julian Croft sank back into his chair. A broken man, the truth having shattered him more completely than any business failure ever could. Alara had won. She had not only saved her project, she had cleared her father's name. But as she looked at Julian's devastated face, she was confronted with a final, terrible choice. The evidence she possessed would not only send Arthur Finch to prison for the rest of his life, it also detailed Julian's willing participation in the illegal sabotage. She held his entire future in her hands. She could destroy him utterly, exposing him as Finch's pawn and co-conspirator, leaving his family name in disgrace for a second generation. Or she could offer him a different kind of justice. The room waited. The city waited. And for the first time in 15 years, Alara Vance held all the power. The question was, what would she do with it? The silence in the hearing room was a vacuum, pulling every eye, every camera lens, toward Alara. She stood at the podium, the architect of this stunning revelation, holding the power of utter annihilation in her hands. She looked at Julian, truly looked at him, and saw not a villain, but a man poisoned by a lie. His life, a long, misguided quest for a justice that was never his to claim. She took a slow, deliberate breath. "The evidence against Arthur Finch is conclusive," she announced, her voice resonating with a calm finality. "I am forwarding this entire file to the district attorney's office. I trust they will pursue justice for all the families he has destroyed." She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. Then, she turned her gaze to the commission. "As for Mr. Croft," she continued, and the room held its breath. "His actions were reprehensible. They were driven by deceit and malice. But they were also born from a lie that has consumed his family for 15 years. A lie crafted by the man who was the true architect of their suffering." She was not excusing him. She was reframing him. "Justice," she said, her words clear and unwavering, "should be directed at the source of the poison, not just at its victims. I will leave it to the authorities to determine Mr. Croft's legal culpability. But my fight is not with him. It is with the man who turned us into enemies." It was an act of astonishing grace. She had the power to crush him, and she chose not to. She chose to aim her weapon at the real monster and, in doing so, offered Julian not forgiveness, but something far more valuable, a chance to escape the prison of his past. In the days that followed, the city was consumed by the story. Arthur Finch was arrested in a dramatic raid on his penthouse apartment. His empire of lies dismantled overnight. The media frenzy was relentless. David Chen, facing federal charges, cooperated fully, detailing his role in the conspiracy. The commission, in an emergency session, unanimously approved all permits for the Phoenix Project, issuing a public apology to Alara Vance. Julian Croft disappeared from public life, stripped of Finch's funding. His company collapsed. He was facing a litany of civil lawsuits and a federal investigation. But Alara's statement had shifted the public narrative. He was seen less as a master villain and more as a tragic, manipulated fool. A week after the hearing, Alara received a short, handwritten note delivered by a courier. "I was wrong. About everything. J.C." She read it, folded it, and put it away. It wasn't an apology. Not really. It was a confession. A quiet admission of a life wasted on a false crusade. She arranged to meet him one last time. They met in a small, empty park overlooking the river, far from the eyes of the media. He looked older, diminished. The charismatic arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out weariness. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough. "At the hearing. You could have buried me. Why didn't you?" "Because my father wouldn't have wanted me to," Alara said simply. "He wasn't a man who believed in revenge. He believed in building things. Destroying you would have just created more rubble. I'm tired of rubble. Julian." They stood in silence for a few moments, two strangers bound by a shared, painful history. "Finch didn't just take our money," Julian said, looking out at the water. "He took our fathers. He took our past. He made my whole life a mistake." "You have a chance to build a new one," Alara replied, "one that isn't based on a lie." It wasn't forgiveness. It was closure. A quiet, mutual acknowledgement of the damage done, and a final, definitive closing of that dark chapter. She walked away without looking back, leaving him to grapple with the wreckage of his life. Her own path was clear, and it led forward, toward the future she was determined to build. Months later, a crisp autumn sun shone down on a field of turned earth. The derelict warehouses had been cleared, and the ground, once scarred by industrial decay, was now ready for new life. It was the groundbreaking ceremony for the Phoenix Project. It was also the exact site where the offices of North Star Ventures had once stood. Ilara stood at a podium, looking out at a crowd of community leaders, joyful residents, and hopeful young entrepreneurs. Marcus and Anya stood in the front row, beaming with pride. Today, we are not just breaking ground, Ilara said, her voice carrying over the crowd, full of warmth and strength. We are planting a seed of hope, of community, of a future where progress is measured not by the height of our buildings, but by the strength of our foundations. She spoke of her vision, of green spaces and affordable homes, of opportunity and inclusion. Then, she made a final announcement. The first building we will construct on this site will not be a corporate tower or a luxury condominium, she declared. It will be a community center, a place for learning, for creating, for supporting the next generation of innovators. It will offer grants and mentorship to young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds, so they can build their own dreams on solid ground. She paused, taking a deep breath. This center will be named in honor of the families whose dreams were shattered on this very land years ago. It will be called the North Star Center. She didn't specify which families. She didn't have to. By naming it for the failed venture that had destroyed them both, she was transforming a symbol of pain and division into one of healing and shared purpose. It was the ultimate act of rebirth. Her revenge was not destruction, but creation. She was using her power not to settle a score, but to build a better world from the ashes of the past. As the crowd erupted in applause, Ilara's gaze swept over the faces before her. She saw a young woman standing near the back, her eyes wide with inspiration, clutching a folder of what looked like her own blueprints. She reminded Ilara of herself, all those years ago, full of fire and ideas, standing on the outside, looking in. Ilara met the young woman's eyes and gave her a subtle, encouraging nod. A silent promise passed between them. The torch was being passed. The cycle of destruction was broken. Here, on this redeemed ground, a new legacy would rise. Ilara Vance was no longer a survivor of a storm, or a victor in a war. She was a source of light, and she was just getting started.